My name is Ben, and I used to work as a civil engineer. In 2020, I was a part of a small team tasked with restoring an old lighthouse on the Marine coast. This wasn't just any lighthouse. Built in the 1870s, it had been abandoned for decades and earned a grim reputation among the locals. But to us, it was just another project, a chance to bring history back to life. At least, that's what I thought. We arrived in the late spring, excited to get started. The lighthouse was perched on a jagged cliff, its rusting metal frame and crumbling walls standing defiantly against the roaring waves. It was breathtaking in its isolation. The first time I set foot inside, I felt an inexplicable chill. I chalked it up to the damp air seeping through the cracked windows. The foreman Dan briefed us on the structural issues, cracks in the walls, corroded beams, and the lantern room's glass shattered long ago. But the oddest feature was the walls themselves. 2 layers of thick stone separated by a hollow space filled with old concrete. Rumor has it, Dan said grinning, some workers fell into the concrete mix during the constructions. The locals call it the Wall of Bones. I laughed it off, but something about his tone didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the only strange thing about this place. By the second week, I started noticing the odd occurrences. Tools would go missing, only to show up hours later in the places we hadn't been working. At first, we blamed each other, but then there were the noises of faint tapping, like someone knocking from inside the walls. It was easy to dismiss it as wind or settling stone during the day. At night, though, it was harder to ignore. One evening, I stayed late to finish inspecting the foundation. As I worked, the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the inner layer of the wall. I froze, listening. Then, a voice, faint and muffled, called my name. I dropped my flashlight, its beam skittering across the floor. My rational mind told me it was impossible. No one else was there, and no one could be inside the wall. But I swear on everything I hold dear, I heard it. I left in a hurry, muttering excuses to Dan about needing rest. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I mentioned the incident to Sarah, one of my junior engineers. She had been acting jumpy herself, and I wondered if she'd experienced anything similar. Her face turned pale. I wasn't going to say anything, she whispered, but yesterday, I found footprints in the dust upstairs. They weren't ours, Ben. They were barefoot. We decided to investigate together. Armed with flashlights and the crowbar, we climbed the narrow staircase to the top. The lantern room was just as we'd left it, empty. But as we shone our lights across the floor, we saw them. Those footprints, small, barefoot, and leaning towards the edge of the room where a shattered window overlooked the sea. There's no way someone climbed up here, I said, my voice trembling. Not without us noticing. Sarah nodded, but she looked uneasy. What if they didn't climb? What if they were already here? That night, Dan called a meeting. He did heard our stories and admitted he'd been hearing whispers during his rounds. Others chimed in with their own experiences. That includes flickering lights, strange shadows, a pervasive sense of being watched. We decided to press on with the work but agreed to stick together from then on. The next few days were uneventful, almost peaceful. We focused on reinforcing the structure and ignored the occasional oddity. Then we reached the section of wall that needed the most repair, the so-called Wall of Bones. As we chipped away at the crumbling concrete, the smell hit us first, a sickly, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. Dan paused, frowning. Probably just old seaweed trapped in the wall, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Then the jackhammer punched through to the hollow space inside. A rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it a sound like a long sigh. We all stepped back, coughing and covering our noses. When the dust settled, we peered inside. At first we saw nothing but darkness. Then as the flashlight beam cuts through the gloom, we saw them. Bones. Human bones. Dozens of them, fused into the hardened concrete. Sarah gagged, and one of the crew muttered a prayer. Dan's face was ashen. We'll call the authorities, he said. His voice was too shaky. Everyone out now. His voice was trembling like no other. That night, none of us slept. The authorities arrived in the next morning, cordoning off the area and questioning us individually. But the unease lingered. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if protesting the discovery. Then the worst happened. Sarah disappeared. We searched the lighthouse from top to bottom, but she was nowhere to be found. Her tools were left neatly in place, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if she'd vanished into the thin air. The police combed the area, but the cliffs were treacherous and the sea unforgiving. They assumed she had fallen, her body swept away by the waves, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something else had happened. Something really, really worse. The project was suspended indefinitely, and we were sent home. I tried to move on, but the lighthouse haunted my thoughts. Very stressful time of my life. Months later, I received an anonymous package. Inside was a journal, old, weathered, and written in shaky handwriting. It belonged to the lighthouse keeper who had lived there in the late 1800s. His entry spoke of the workers disappearing during the construction, their screams swallowed by the concrete walls. He wrote of hearing their cries at night, begging to be freed. The final entry was the most chilling one. They are not at rest. The walls hunger still. They call to me, and I fear I cannot resist much longer. If anyone finds this, burn that lighthouse. Do not let it stand. I stared at the journal, my hands trembling. Suddenly I understood. The lighthouse wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was something worse. A predator feeding on those who dared disturb it. To this day, the lighthouse remains abandoned, a silent sentinel against the crashing waves. But I know better. It's not watching the sea, it's watching us, waiting for its next meal.